You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thanks for joining Revolution 250, where we look at events that took place 250 years ago this week. This is from the American Revolution Podcast, a short bonus episode to remind you about these important anniversaries from the Revolutionary War. This week, we remember the fighting in Quebec as British General Carleton attempts to lift the siege of Saint-Jean's, and Colonel Arnold arrives with Continental soldiers at the gates of Quebec on October 29, 1775. During the fall of 1775, there were two main theaters of war in America. The siege of Boston was pretty static. The Americans did not have enough ammunition and were unsure of their militia army's ability to storm the defenses that the British had erected in Boston. At the same time, the British commanders, General Thomas Gage and his successor, General William Howe, believed they did not have a large enough army to go on the offensive against the besiegers. The result was that the two sides mostly maintained their lines and did little more than that. The other action was taking place in Quebec. After the Americans had captured Fort Ticonderoga, they moved up Lake Champlain and began besieging Saint-Jean. There were only 2 regiments of British regulars in Canada at the time, less than 1,000 men, and General Guy Carleton sent almost all of them to Saint-Jean to stop the American advance. General Carleton himself did not go with the army. Instead, he remained in Montreal or Quebec City, trying to raise loyalists or Indian forces to help support these regulars. In late October, Carleton assembled a force of about 800 men, which would roughly double the number of defenders at Saint-Jean. Carleton led this relief force as it marched toward the siege. On October 30th, Carleton's relief force was crossing the St. Lawrence River when the Green Mountain Boys, led by Colonel Seth Warner, attacked them. The Loyalists engaged but were forced back. Carleton then led a flanking maneuver against the enemy, but this was also turned back. The relief force would have to withdraw back to Montreal and eventually back to Quebec City. Meanwhile, at the siege, General David Wooster brought hundreds more reinforcements of Continentals. On November 1st, General Montgomery sent a prisoner over to the enemy under a flag of truce, informing them that General Clinton's relief force had failed and was turned back. The British commander did not surrender immediately. He suspected a ruse and wanted to make sure that the relief force really was not arriving. However, 2 days later, the British defenders surrendered. The British commander, Major Charles Preston, surrendered his 500 soldiers and 41 artillery pieces. Among the officers who surrendered was a young lieutenant by the name of John Andre. The bulk of the British regulars in Canada became American prisoners of war. The Continental Army could advance on Quebec virtually unopposed, but the 2-month siege had forced the offensive into the Canadian winter, which brought its own difficulties. On November 5th, though, Montgomery began to advance the army toward Montreal. Around the same time, another threat arrived for the British. The first of Colonel Benedict Arnold's soldiers emerged from the Maine wilderness in the little town of Sertigan, Quebec. The men were starving and in rags, having crossed through what everyone thought was an impossible wilderness. The soldiers regained their strength by slaughtering a few cattle and relying on the assistance of locals. They would soon be ready to attack Quebec from the north. The city of Quebec faced threats from both the south and the north, with enemy Continental soldiers advancing in both directions. It seemed clear to everyone that the city of Quebec would soon fall to the Americans. I hope you've enjoyed this Revolution 250 moment. I originally covered these events in episodes 72 and 76 of the American Revolution podcast. I also encourage you to subscribe for free on whatever podcast platform you like, or check out our most recent episodes at blog.amrevpodcast.com. Thanks again for listening to this Revolution 250 moment on the American Revolution podcast.